Welcome to Random Flyer, the podcast that brings you the true stories of New Zealand's aviation pioneers, the machines they flew, and the decisions that shape the skies we fly through today. The series covers the inauguration and growth of the main trunk operator, Union Airways, along with the feeder services like Air Travel New Zealand Limited, Cook Strait Airways and East Coast Airways, as well as the unsuccessful competitor, New Zealand Airways. There are 5 videos in total, so check the homepage or subscribe to get the rest of the series. Today we'll be diving deep into the turbulent history of New Zealand Airways Limited, a company that tried to play a pioneering role in the early days of commercial aviation in New Zealand. From bold acquisitions to heartbreaking setbacks, this is a story of resilience, vision, struggle, but ultimately of failure. Our story begins in 1933 with a man named Horatio Murdoch Mackay, the managing director of New Zealand Airways. Aviation in New Zealand was still in its infancy, with only a small handful of companies operating light aircraft. But Mackay, a man with a vision for the future, wasn't content with just small-scale operations. He dreamed of a fully fledged airline that could serve both the North and South Islands, connecting New Zealand's isolated communities in ways never before imagined. For several years, New Zealand Airways used the Saltwater Creek airfield near Timaru as its base for activities where, by the early 1930s, it had built a fleet of 3 Simmons Spartans, which was a 1920s British single-engine 2-seat biplane trainer/tourer, and a single de Havilland DH-80A Puss Moth, which is a single-engine 3-seat high-wing high-performance monoplane. The company employed 2 pilot instructors who were stationed in Timaru and had a fair number of pupils, with several residents of the town having acquired proficiency as pilots. Saltwater Creek was also the maintenance and engineering base for the company. On top of the 2 pilot instructors, the company employed 8 engineers. Overhauls, repairs and rebuilding of airplanes was carried out in the workshops for customers from all over New Zealand. On April 19, 1933, Mackay made a daring move. He purchased an Avro 618 triple-engine passenger aircraft named the Southern Sky from Australia National Airways Limited. The price was £2,150. And the purchase was made in an auction of surplus equipment. The Southern Sky was no ordinary aircraft. The Avro 618 was a Fokker design. It was a variant of Charles Kingsford-Smith's Southern Cross. It had a capacity for 8 passengers and a gross weight of 5,300 kilos, more than 5 times greater than the rest of his fleet. It was more than just a plane for New Zealand Airways. It was a statement of intent. Mackay's vision was beginning to take shape as he began plans for a regular air service between the major cities of Auckland, Timaru and Christchurch. The Southern Sky's resemblance to the famed Southern Cross, flown by Sir Charles Kingsford-Smith, made it a powerful symbol of New Zealand Airways' ambitions. However, it was not to be. By October 1933, for lack of government subsidy, the Southern Sky was disposed of and put back into service in Australia. As 1934 arrived, Mackay's bold vision for the future took another step forward. The company placed an order for 5 Boeing Canada Model 40 H4s, an American single-engine biplane built in Canada that could carry 4 passengers, and that would become the cornerstone of their expansion plans. He had planned and made applications for 3 routes, one running Whangarei, Auckland, Hamilton, Rotorua, Whakatane, Gisborne, with an extension from Whangarei to Gisborne as required, Route 2 which ran from Auckland to Rotorua, Napier, Masterton, Wellington, and Route 3 which ran from Christchurch, Timaru, Cromwell, Queenstown, Dunedin. It was basically a main trunk route competing with Union Airways. The first 2 of the planes arrived in Dunedin on the evening of Sunday 30th of June 1935 from Vancouver. The Boeing planes were ordered with the hopes that they would expand the company's routes across New Zealand. But as the planes arrived, Mackay's dreams began to unravel. The Transport Coordination Board, the regulatory body tasked with overseeing aviation in the country, refused to grant New Zealand Airways the licenses they needed to operate the Boeings on those intended routes. The board's reasoning was simple. They didn't believe the planes were suitable for the routes, even though they were proven machines, capable of covering long distances and carrying substantial loads. 2 of the planes were already in New Zealand when the Transport Coordination Board's refusal came through. These planes, which had cost New Zealand Airways more than £15,000 each, were now stranded. Mackay, known for his fiery temper, was understandably furious. When asked what he intended to do with them once the board had declined their use, he famously remarked he'd set fire to them. These machines, which had been ordered in good faith, were now worthless to the company without the licenses they need to operate. The board disregarded the proposals as being too big a step up financially for the company. They also took issue with the Boeing Canada planes, which were considered obsolete cast-offs from the American airline system. They were a derivative of the original Boeing mail plane, first flown in the mid-1920s, and between the late 1920s and the time of the board's decision, 13 of the 80 planes that had been built had been involved in fatal accidents. It wasn't just the financial loss that hurt, it was the realisation that New Zealand Airways was being thwarted by the very government body meant to support them. The 2 planes that had made their way to New Zealand were now effectively useless, and the remaining 3 had their shipments halted. The dreams of expanding air service across the country seemed to be slipping away, and Mackay's frustration reached a boiling point. The decision was a major blow. These Boeing planes had been ordered months in advance, and New Zealand Airways had already committed significant resources in their purchase. They had been hopeful that these machines would enable them to provide a faster, more effective air service across New Zealand, connecting cities that were otherwise isolated. As 1935 unfolded, the challenges mounted for New Zealand Airways. With the Boeings grounded and their future uncertain, the company turned to the legal system to challenge the Transport Coordination Board's decision. But the fight was an uphill battle. Mackay's frustration with the bureaucracy deepened as other companies, some of which had barely begun to operate, were granted licenses for major routes. By the end of 1935, as the successful bidders had mostly become operational, New Zealand Airways became embroiled in a heated dispute over its treatment by the Transport Licensing Board, and the Otago Expansion League was at the forefront of advocating for the company. The League raised concerns that New Zealand Airways had been unfairly excluded from receiving route licenses, while other companies, some of which were barely formed or not even operational, were granted licenses. They felt that New Zealand Airways had been unjustly sidelined, despite its pioneering efforts in establishing air services in New Zealand. Former Minister of Transport, J.G. Coates, had argued that New Zealand Airways was not deprived of anything by the board, suggesting that no regular services had been in operation at the time, and implying that New Zealand Airways had not yet been ready to provide trunk services. However, the League contested the view, pointing out that New Zealand Airways had been laying the groundwork for such services since 1933, and had even arranged for the importation of aircraft to begin offering services as soon as the air transport legislation was enacted. The League also highlighted the troubling gap between the Transport Board's knowledge, cited New Zealand Airways correspondence, and discussions with government officials as evidence that the company had been actively planning these services for years. Despite this, they were passed over in favour of newer, less established companies. The League's response to Coates' remarks further emphasised that New Zealand Airways had been left in limbo for months, unable to expand its operations or secure financing, a situation that had a detrimental impact on the company's financial health. In addition to the licensing issue, the League also addressed the specifics of the air taxi licenses. While New Zealand Airways had been granted permission to continue operating in a similar capacity as before, it was forced to lay off staff and halt its expansion due to the uncertainty surrounding its ability to operate in a larger capacity. They contended that the temporary removal of their licenses had a serious impact on the company, which had previously been operating with a clear path forward. They also pointed out that other companies, such as the Mount Cook Tourist Company, had received similar licenses, despite having no prior experience in operating air services. The League's grievances also extended to the Transport Board's handling of the application process. According to their records, New Zealand Airways' application for a trunk service was unfairly ranked behind other companies, even though they had been the first to initiate serious discussions with the government and had aircraft ready for service. The League accused the board of mishandling the sequence of applications, noting that New Zealand Airways had been the oldest and most established operator in the country, yet it was treated as if it had no legitimate claim to a licence. The League concluded by demanding a full inquiry into the issue, urging that it be held in Dunedin, where much of the evidence and key witnesses were based. They felt strongly that an investigation was necessary to determine if New Zealand Airways had been denied a fair opportunity to expand and contribute to the nation's air transport development. The League's persistence in challenging the board's decisions reflected a broader concern about the fairness of the air services licensing process and the need to support pioneering companies that had laid the foundation for the airline industry in New Zealand. New Zealand Airways' frustration with the regulatory process culminated the following year in a public petition calling for compensation or the granting of trunk air routes. The petition, which was reviewed by the Public Petitions Committee, received a favourable outcome in September 1936, although it did not come with a clear resolution. By this stage, airline services had been in operation for more than 18 months, and Union Airways' main truck network had been running since the beginning of the year. The committee's recommendation to the House of Representatives highlighted the unique service that New Zealand Airways had rendered to the country, particularly in the development of air-mindedness. It recognised the financial risks that the company had taken in the early stages of aviation, operating with the understanding that losses would be offset by future profits once air services had become established. The committee also pointed out the two conditions set by the Transport Board and created further complications: the requirement for British-made aircraft and the stipulation that New Zealand capital be used. While New Zealand Airways had complied with these conditions, using Canadian-made Boeing aircraft that at the time fit the definition of British, and offering to undertake to raise the necessary finance within New Zealand, the board had granted licences to other companies that did not meet those conditions. The committee's report also noted that New Zealand Airways had been denied valuable licences, while companies without substantial capital or experience had been granted them. In particular, the report drew attention to the case where the board had promised to issue a licence to a company that had not even been formed and which never materialised. This decision was viewed as especially egregious, given the investments made by New Zealand Airways to ensure it was in a position to operate efficiently and effectively were significant. The committee's recommendation urged the government to consider New Zealand Airways' petition, either through substantial compensation or by granting the company the trunk air services it had been denied. The report emphasised that New Zealand Airways had been placed in a precarious position, unable to recover its development costs or make up for losses incurred during the uncertainty of its licensing status. Thus, the outcome of New Zealand Airways' petition was more one of recognition but not immediate resolution. The committee's favourable recommendation set the stage for future discussions, but the company's journey was over. The complexities of the aviation industry and the regulatory landscape at the time left New Zealand Airways fighting not only for its right to operate, but also just for the acknowledgement of its pioneering work it had done in the development of New Zealand's airline infrastructure. Despite the setbacks, New Zealand Airways left a legacy that would influence the future of aviation, and though the Boeing planes were never used in the way that Mackay had envisaged, the company had, through its pioneering efforts at Saltwater Creek, enabled future developments in the aviation industry. The groundwork had been laid, the infrastructure set up, and the public's trust in air travel had been earned. While New Zealand Airways itself may not have seen the success it dreamed of, it helped pave the way for other airlines and set a standard for the industry. Mackay's vision would eventually be realised, not through his own company though, but through the impact he had on the future of the airline industry in New Zealand. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the early days of New Zealand Airways. Stay tuned for more episodes as we continue to explore the struggles and triumphs of New Zealand's airline pioneers. Until next time, take care.